James, whenever you're kind of settled and ready, you may begin.
Okay, and this is just on, right?
Yeah.
Good, okay. My name is Bob James. I'm a longtime citizen of the town of Dundas, worked and lived in Dundas. I've been involved with work around the art committee for about the last 6 months or so. My role here, what I see in terms of the goal of my presentation, is to look at and to perhaps challenge one of the prejudices, I think, of the art process to date. And that prejudice is the idea that a school needs to be greater than or equal to 1,000 students. This grows out of, we're told, of the need for programs and the number of programs that have to come forward, and also the need for funding, which is tied, of course, to students. I want to challenge that assumption and present some data for that. Some months ago now, when we met with Trustee Brennan, one of the things that she put forward, which I think is absolutely correct and a very good idea, is that we need a school that provides good education for our students at a reasonable cost. Obviously, that's what all of you want, and it's not easy to do at this particular point in time. Let's begin by looking at the education part of it. And I want to look at the issues of small schools versus larger schools in this case. Begin with the basics. A lot of the information that we have comes from the States, because that's where people have begun now to go back to looking at smaller schools and begun to compare them with the larger schools which are there as well as here. They have shown in many of their studies that in fact there is an advantage to the education process in a smaller school versus a larger school. Higher rates of graduation, higher marks on graduation, more people continuing on and finishing college and university, and more satisfaction with the education process. That's American data. Is there any Canadian data? Well, there are in fact two that I was able to find. City of Edmonton did a study looking at mathematics scores in their grade 10 students across the city of Edmonton and found that the schools smaller than 600 by and large did better than the schools that were larger. Students did better. There's also data from Saskatchewan, which looked across the province at graduation rates, test scores, and student involvement in schools, and again found that overall smaller schools did better than larger schools. This was not a strict urban-rural split, it was a small versus large split. So there is some data and beginning to be data in this country as well. However, aside from educational value on the technical parts of it, I think we need to look at the greatest benefit, which has to do with the social areas of education. We all know that the number of problem kids, so-called problem children in our schools, is increasing. We have an increased number of autistic children, depressed children, bullied or bullying children, anorectic children, kids with problems, psychosocial problems, drug problems, perhaps bullying problems as well. And we also have a decrease in community involvement among our student population. A scary statistic is that in the last election, almost 3 out of 4 people in the age 18 to 20 did not vote in our last election. And that, I think, is a concern for us as citizens of this country as well. Large schools, as one educator notes, neither nourish the spirit nor educate the mind. What big schools do is to remind most of us that we don't count a lot. In 1999, there was a report out of the United States Department of Education comparing large schools with small schools. Found that compared to small schools, large schools had 9 times the crime rate, 3 times the vandalism, 4 times the theft, 4 times the physical attacks, and 10 times more weapons. That's American data, but it's probably not that dissimilar from Canada. The conclusion of that report was that anonymity in large schools breeds not only contempt and anger, but also physical danger and interferes with our schooling and with our education. Small schools, in contrast, are more accessible for parents. Parents have increased involvement. There is increased teacher satisfaction and teacher involvement. There is decreased administration time for the administration because you have a smaller staff to deal with. There's increased teacher-student interactions. There's increased student involvement, including extracurricular activities. Looking specifically at Parkside, which is a school in my neighborhood. Parkside is actually at the top end of the small school range, but is still about 600 students as we sit today. Parkside has had many successful graduates in the past, graduates in mathematics and physics and sports. The Parkside students do well in this city, in this province, and in the world. They're known throughout many parts of the world. Our academics are strong and their sports are strong. Students from Parkside have a great involvement in the community. They have a member sitting on the Dundas Community Council. Many of the Dundas Citizens of the Year picked by the BIA come from that area. The co-ops, of course, we've already had mentioned. There's a great deal of involvement from co-ops, in the co-ops. A lot of help in the food drive. Okay, so you say, well, that's fine, but what about cost? We have to concern ourselves with cost. This is a time of decreasing of financial availability, and what about costs? Traditionally, the cost that people look at is the cost per student. A smaller school generally has a higher graduation rate, so it may also make sense in this case to look at the cost per graduating student. And generally, because there is less vandalism, less crime, less bullying, cost of administration to control students will be less as well. Cost of administration for meeting for teachers, where there's less staff, meeting costs go down, meeting times go down, and the productivity of your highest cost resource, the teachers, is correspondingly less. Overall, looking mostly at American data again, but probably somewhat the same in Canada, it appears that small schools are likely equal in cost to larger schools and may in fact be cheaper. True, the smaller schools don't have the ability of doing all of the wide variety of programs that a 1,200, 1,500 school does. But if we can produce better citizens, and I would contend that we do, isn't that what it's all about and what our education system should be? The challenge we have is to move away from the bureaucratic state ideas of the 1960s and 70s, which are ideas which began in the United States, have moved to Canada, and move more towards into the 21st century. A couple of presentations after me, Patrick Rowan is going to talk about a new type of program in school that's very exciting as a way to look at this. But this could be, Parkside could become an example of a small school, an example standing out for Hamilton, for Ontario, and for Canada. I just challenge you folks to dare to dream and to think small. Thank you.
Trustee Brennan?
Yes, Dr. James, thank you very much for your continuous passion on small schools and the value of intimate opportunities for students. I do have two questions, though. I'm wondering if Dr. James, in extolling the virtues of small schools, is actually asking us to keep both schools open in Dundas, and then I have a second question.
Okay, we'll go with the first.
I think on a personal level, I don't think it's necessary to close either school. We can renovate and fix both schools, and they could do well as smaller schools. But I know Parkside much better. I don't know Highland very well, so I know Parkside certainly did.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And then in the research that Dr. James has done, what would qualify as a large school in terms of numbers?
Greater than 1,000.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have student trustee Shen next.
Through the chair, I was just wondering, with the data you presented, is it for high schools or elementary schools?
It's for high schools. It's for high schools, and it's actually quite dramatic. If I could actually take another minute, there was a school in, one of the things that blew me away, was a school that was in East Harlem in New York City, a poor immigrant area, mostly people identified color. Graduation rates were about 10%, 15%. This was a school of about 2,000. They broke it up into 6 separate administrative schools within the same building. So they didn't change the building structure, but they did put 6 schools within that became specialized and were their own administrative units. Graduation rates went up to 90% within a few years. Parent and student involvement increased dramatically. Vandalism and crime went way down. That's an American experience. It's not Canadian. But it's dramatic, and I think there is hope for that. And that was a high school.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking for a motion then. Trustee Turkshire, thank you. Seconded by Trustee Brennan. All those in favor of receiving this presentation? Thank you, trustees, and thank you very much for coming, sir.